Every generation has been convinced that it would be the last. The Vikings awaited Ragnarok. Medieval Europe feared Judgment Day, and the Millerites sold their possessions. The world braced for nuclear fire, Y2K, the Mayan calendar, and, more recently, artificial intelligence, climate collapse, and whatever fresh catastrophe tomorrow's headlines have in store. And yet, morning came anyway. So why are we like this? Why, across every culture and every century, do we seem irresistibly drawn towards imagining the end? Is it fear, hope, a need for meaning? Or is the apocalypse simply the greatest story humanity has ever told itself? Tonight, we'll trace the long romance between mankind and doom, and perhaps discover that what we're really searching for isn't the end of the world, but our place within it. History and hysteria, religion and the far reaches of the occult. These and more are the children of a common thing, belief, an intrinsic part of what makes us human. I'm your host, Liam Blackwood, an independent scholar of esoterica and eccentricity, a rational skeptic, father of two, writer, and lover of life. Pull up a chair, fellow lamplighters, and let us cast the shadows back a bit as we examine what lies beneath the light of Occam's lantern. So here we are, episode 10 of Year Zero Anno Lanternus. No, we're not doing that. So, a bit of news before we officially begin. Lately, I've been getting absolutely swarmed with requests for how to sell one's soul for money, how to make pacts with the devil, how to secure the love of someone who is non-reciprocal. I wish I was joking, but seriously, I have been getting at least 2 messages a day. I'm certain these aren't actually listeners, rather the usual rush of undereducated fools who wouldn't be able to tell a demon from a salesman. But it is amusing that it happens so often and so quickly. I answer as basically as I can, but then offer personal consultation and real informative lessons for a price. The ponderings have, so far, stopped there. It's amazing how deeply one desires, so long as it's free. On that note, I do offer divination practices, lessons in various esoterica from runes to Goetia, lesser magic to greater, but for a fee to be discussed before business proceeds. My time is, after all, valuable. On the subject of personal magic, I have officially lost more than 125 pounds within a year and a half, going from 325 at my heaviest to just this morning dipping under 199 pounds for the first time since high school. Diet, exercise, and calorie tracking alone. No GLPs or peptides, though if I could have access and afford those, I certainly would have. No shame in using every tool you have available to your reach. Back to the podcast, though, I have settled on a weekly release format. You can now join us every Friday for new episodes of Occam's Lantern, starting, well, today. And on that note, well, let's talk about the end of the world. It's a topic humanity has been obsessed with for about as long as humanity has been capable of writing things down. In fact, the oldest surviving Doomsday prophecy that we know of dates back nearly 4,000 years to ancient Mesopotamia. An Assyrian clay tablet lamented the state of the world, claiming corruption was rampant, children no longer respected their parents, and the end of days surely couldn't be far behind. 4,000 years later, I imagine some of you have heard almost that exact same sentence this week. That is perhaps the first clue that we're dealing with something far older and far more interesting than simple prophecy. Of course, every culture didn't view the end of the world the same way. For many, the apocalypse wasn't merely a destruction. The Norse awaited Ragnarok not as oblivion, but as a violent ending that gave way to renewal. Hindu cosmology speaks of a vast cycles of creation and destruction stretching beyond human comprehension. And the Abrahamic religions tend towards a final judgment, a definitive conclusion to history itself. Different stories, but strikingly similar impulses. So tonight, we're going to wander through it all. We'll visit ancient prophecies and failed predictions, cults that sold everything in preparation for tomorrow that never came. Or so they thought. The psychology behind why every generation believes it is living in history's final chapter. The industries that have learned to profit from our fear. The science that sometimes warns us of genuine existential risks. And the media that often blurs the line between possibility and inevitability. And finally, we'll ask a much simpler question. Why are we so enamored with doom? Because if history has taught us anything, it's that humanity has predicted the end of the world almost 1,000 times, and yet, somehow, the morning keeps coming. From the previous mention of the Assyrian tablet, which easily could have been a social media post today, it's interesting that every generation is the one watching civilization come apart at the seams, and the end is nigh. It really got me wondering, why are we so convinced we're always living in the final chapter? And as I stated, this isn't always the case. There's some that are very cyclical. Survivors emerge and a new generation inherits the world, and the cycle continues. Many Eastern traditions take that idea even further. Time isn't an arrow, it's a wheel. A very stark contrast to the Abrahamic eschatological traditions. History moving towards final judgment. The details differ, but the shape of the story is familiar. History has a destination. And that's an important distinction. As one view says history repeats, another says it concludes, both have had enormous influence on the way civilizations think about themselves. But here's the interesting part. Whether history or people believe in cycles or finales, they're almost always convinced that they are living exactly next to the important bit. Not eventually, not someday, but soon. TM. The Romans thought it, medieval Europe thought it, the people who survived the Black Death thought it, the people staring at mushroom clouds in the 1960s thought it. Plenty of people scrolling headlines today think it. Different century, again, same feeling. And that's what today's episode is about. Not whether the world can end, it certainly can in one way or another. The question I'm interested in is why our minds seem so eager to believe that the finale is just over the next hill. Is it solipsism? A need to be center stage during the main event of the show? Maybe. But once you start looking, you begin to notice something curious. Our fascination with the apocalypse may tell us far more about ourselves than it ever has about the future. After all, if humanity has one enduring talent, it's convincing itself that history has reached its climax. Not just that difficult times are ahead, but that everything is coming to an end. And if this pattern is repeated for thousands of years, I don't think it's enough to simply dismiss every prophet, cult leader, newspaper headline, or internet conspiracy as irrational. There has to be something deeper going on. I think part of the answer is surprisingly simple. Our minds hate complacency. The human brain evolved to notice threats, not stability. A peaceful village doesn't demand our attention nearly as much as smoke on the horizon. From an evolutionary standpoint, the person who assumed everything was fine has often the one who didn't survive long enough to pass that optimism along. We've covered this before in Fears and Tribalism. We inherited nervous minds that constantly scan the horizon for the next disaster. The strange coincidence is that periods of relative peace rarely feel peaceful. Instead, they feel temporary, like the other shoe has to drop. And you can observe this everywhere at any time. We believe that morality is collapsing, children have behaved worse than the last generation, and that society has become uniquely decadent. Oh, and lest I forget, politics have never been so divisive. The details change, but the emotions do not. We remember the crisis vividly because our brains are built to remember danger. Meanwhile, decades of ordinary progress quietly pass without much notice. Psychologists call part of this negativity bias, our tendency to give bad news far more weight than good. It's a remarkably useful survival mechanism, but also a terrible way to judge the state of civilization. If 10 wonderful things happen today and one terrible thing makes the evening news, guess which one you'll remember tomorrow. Of course, modern media only amplifies this instinct. 24-hour news cycles, social media feeds, recommendation algorithms, they aren't necessarily trying to convince you the world is ending, they're trying to convince you to keep watching. And fear is extraordinarily good at holding attention. Hope, not nearly as much. And before long, catastrophe becomes entertainment. We binge documentaries about extinction, watch movies where the earth freezes, floods, burns, explodes, or is invaded. We speculate about rogue AI, asteroid impacts, supervolcanoes, pandemics, solar flares, economic collapse, even zombies. Because, well, sometimes there's legitimate risks worth understanding, but mostly because doom is compelling. There's an odd comfort in imagining the grand finale. It gives us shape to uncertainty, transforming 1,000 little anxieties into one enormous, understandable story. The end. Clean, simple, narratively satisfying. Reality, unfortunately, or fortunately, is rarely so dramatic. History doesn't usually end with a bang, but rather meanders. It stumbles like a drunk in the night, but adapts like an athlete overcoming adversity. And more often than not, what feels like the end of the world turns out to be the end of a world, making room for another. There's an old saying, usually attributed to Martin Luther, though historians argue whether he actually said it, that if he knew the world would end tomorrow, he would still plant an apple tree today. Whether he ever uttered those words isn't especially important. The reason they've endured is because they stand in direct opposition to one of humanity's oldest impulses. We've always believed that our generation would be the one standing at history's finish line. The oldest surviving end-time prophecy that we know of, again, the Assyrian tablets, lamented the same problems we have today. It's a comfort, in a strange way, to learn that nothing has changed that much, and that civilization going off the rails is just another part of the experience. The early Christians expected Christ's return within their own lifetimes. As their generations died, the interpretations shifted. Then they shifted again. Dates came and went, yet the expectations remained. And some, like the aforementioned Norse, believed that it was more akin to a phoenix burning down before the new dawn, winter giving way to spring. Even in myths where the universe itself comes undone, humanity seems oddly incapable of imagining a story that simply stops. There always seems to be another chapter waiting just beyond the ashes. We notice, however, that civilizations, well, as they became more interconnected, something subtly began to change. The apocalypse became personal. No longer was it merely an end of one age to make room for another, but rather became a judgment, final accounting, the cosmic sorting of winners and losers. And so we can see that the evolution of these thoughts in religions of the end times, the early cyclical to the later finality, is, well, it seems to be a mark of progress going backwards. Once you believe every history has a finish line, every war, every plague, eclipse, comet, earthquake suddenly looks like another mile marker on the road towards it. Whether it was the Black Death, a rogue comet, or any year ending in 3 zeros, it all became, for someone, undeniable proof that this was finally it. But, as time and time again is told, history has an inconvenient habit. It keeps waking up the next morning. As humanity marched into the 20th century, something interesting happened to our apocalyptic stories. For thousands of years, doom arrived through prophets, kings, holy texts, or interpretations. Now it came through newspapers, then radio, television, and finally the internet. The delivery system changed the dosage, but the psychology involved was the same old concoction. No event demonstrates this better than the little bright comet that crossed our skies in 1997. For many people listening, the Hale-Bopp was just another astronomical curiosity, a beautiful object that lingered in the night sky for months. Well, for me, it was my first real exposure to the idea that people could genuinely believe the world was about to end. Sure, I'd seen it in movies or stories, but to my 12-year-old self, this was the first time seeing it in the context of real life. I remember seeing the news coverage, adults speaking with absolute seriousness about a group called Heaven's Gate. Images of matching clothes, shoes, quiet suburban homes that suddenly became infamous, and a wild-eyed elder who seemed as though he'd seen beyond the void before I ever knew what the void was. It was surreal, because unlike the fire and brimstone predictions before it, this wasn't built around destruction, it was built around departure. Marshall Applewhite, the leader of Heaven's Gate, taught that Earth was approaching a kind of spiritual recycling. Human civilization had reached a point where it would soon be wiped clean. But there was an escape. Trailing behind the Hale-Bopp comet, he claimed, was a spacecraft, waiting to collect those who were spiritually prepared. In his ideology, death wasn't an ending, it was a transportation, the vehicle of which was the body. Leaving it behind meant boarding the next stage of existence, and in March of 1997, 39 members acted on that belief. They died expecting to wake somewhere beyond the comet. Instead, they became one of history's most haunting reminders of where absolute certainty can lead. It would be a brash mistake to dismiss stories like Heaven's Gate as mere insanity. Insanity alone does not recruit dozens of intelligent, educated adults, and it doesn't organize websites or produce videos, maintain finances, and build a functioning community over decades. Something far more human was at work. Meaning, belonging, purpose, and last of all, certainty. Every one of us craves these, but most of us simply satisfy those needs in healthier ways. Heaven's Gate wasn't frightening because it was alien, but rather because the emotional mechanisms underneath it all are painfully familiar to all of us. The desire to believe that you, not all the billions before or after, are standing at the climax of history. And that's something you'll begin to notice as you study more of these cases, especially in modern times. The apocalypse becomes less about punishment and more about significance. The end isn't merely terrifying, it's exciting. It means you were here when everything changed. The great hand of fate chose your lifetime. That's an intoxicating idea. and one that did not disappear with Heaven's Gate, but rather found a much larger audience in the age of information. If there's one thing that becomes obvious after looking at all of these predictions, it's that the details almost never matter. Different date, prophet, message, and meaning, but the emotional core stays exactly the same. Now that should tell us something. Because if hundreds of failed predictions over thousands of years haven't cured humanity of expecting the end to arrive next Tuesday, maybe the apocalypse isn't just something we believe in. Maybe it's something we need. It sounds strange at first, but think about it. The end of the world is the ultimate explanation. Every uncertainty disappears. All our anxiety is resolved by a single event. Our bills, obligations, disappointments, unfinished dreams, all personal failures just simply stop. There's a peculiar comfort in believing history is almost over. If tomorrow never comes, then we don't have to worry quite so much about what we're going to do with it. Psychologists have spent decades studying something called terror management theory. The idea that much of human culture exists as a way of coping with the knowledge that we are mortal. We know our lives end, yet our minds rebel against this fact. We search for permanence, legacy, meaning. One way of escaping that discomfort is to imagine that everyone is reaching the finish line alongside us. For if civilization is ending, then our own mortality feels not quite so personal. That may sound bleak, but it also explains why every generation quietly assumes it's living in the final chapter. We instinctively mistake proximity for importance. Our own lives feel enormous because they're the only ones we've ever experienced firsthand. The present always feels louder than the past. Every event feels unprecedented while we're living through it. Every election we take part in becomes the most important in history. Every new recession becomes the worst ever. And each global conflict becomes the one that changes it all. The emotional volume feels like it's turned up all the way because we're standing right next to the speakers. History, viewed from a distance, has a way of shrinking those mountains into hills. Now, none of this is meant to dismiss genuine danger. After all, history has shown us that civilizations collapse, empires disappear, wars devastate continents, and plagues kill millions. These things are horrifyingly precise because they have happened. And we have undisputable proof that they're real. But humanity has an unfortunate habit of taking genuine problems and stretching them until they become cosmic certainty. The possibility of catastrophe quietly transforms into the certainty of apocalypse, and it's imperative to realize just how vastly different those two concepts are. Because once certainty enters the picture, someone is usually waiting to sell it. One of the most amusing discoveries you make while researching doomsday predictions is that someone is always making money. Not occasionally or by accident, but always. 60% of the time, they do it all the time. The moment people become convinced catastrophe is approaching, an entire ecosystem appears around that fear. During Y2K, companies sold survival kits, generators, water storage systems, and enough freeze-dried food to survive a winter in Antarctica. When the Mayan calendar panic hit in 2012, there were documentaries, books, television specials multiplying like rabbits. The Cold War gave us fallout shelters and canned goods, and, well, modern anxieties have capitalized on this the most, with bunkers, tactical gear, cryptocurrency evangelists, and an endless parade of YouTube thumbnails featuring mushroom clouds and red arrows. My personal favorite remains the Rapture pet care services that popped up during various end-time scares. The pitch was essentially, if you're taken up to heaven and your pets are left behind, well, don't worry, we'll take care of them for a fee. You Really have to admire the entrepreneurial spirit there. Of course, none of this means that people are selling these things out of pure maliciousness. Some genuinely believe what they're saying. Others, most I would say, simply recognize a market. Fear has always been excellent for business because frightened people hate uncertainty. If someone offers a plan, a product, or a secret piece of knowledge that promises control, if even a little bit, many of us will be tempted at least to listen. The modern media landscape pours gasoline on that impulse. A headline saying, "Scientists continue studying a potential long-term risk," gets modest attention. A headline implying civilization may collapse within our lifetime spreads like wildfire. Algorithms quickly learn that doom is what keeps people clicking, which creates a strange feedback loop. We see more catastrophic predictions, which makes the world feel more dangerous, which makes us seek out more information, which feeds the algorithms, which deliver us even more catastrophic predictions. Before long, it can seem as though humanity is hanging on by a thread, even while most of us are living through one of the safest and most prosperous periods of human history. That's the part that I find fascinating. Our ancestors may have worried about famine, plague, war, and infant mortality as routine facts of life. And we worry about those things too, but we also carry a device in our pocket that delivers every disaster on Earth directly into our nervous system. A village in the year 1200 might hear about one catastrophe a season. We hear about 20 before breakfast. It's a small wonder why nowadays the apocalypse always feels close. One of the most unsettling realizations that surfaced while I was putting this episode together is that there comes a point where believing in the apocalypse ceases to become passive. And for a lot of us, predicting the end becomes almost recreational. Speculation at the dinner table, arguing in comment sections, or, like I said before, stocking up enough to survive a long winter. Maybe one in Michigan. I'll use that example this time. But there's nothing particularly sinister in any of that. Preparing for uncertainty is one thing. Hoping to be right is an entirely different subject. Those who became dissatisfied with waiting was always a smaller group, but a more frightening one. Once you're convinced that the end has already been written, it doesn't take much to convince yourself that you're supposed to play a role in bringing it about. If the world is destined to burn, what difference does one match make? It's an old temptation, wearing remarkably modern clothes. As we touched on in episode 7, Alm Shinrikyo convinced themselves that global catastrophe wasn't merely inevitable, it was necessary. Their prophecy became a blueprint, culminating in the unfortunate Tokyo subway attack. The movement wasn't trying to survive the end of the world, it had begun rehearsing it. And that pattern isn't confined to religion either. Strip away the theology and it continues to appear in political movements, extremist ideologies, and revolutionary fantasies. The vocabulary changes, but the underlying psychology remains strangely recognizable. One group dreams of accelerating economic collapse, another insisting that civilization itself deserves to fall. Others becoming enamored with fantasies of civil war, convinced that only after everything is reduced to rubble can something purer take its place. Within these circles, the apocalypse stops being a warning and becomes a goal. We've begun to see this more dangerously in the higher-ups of certain governments, something that's quite troubling, but I'm sure that thousands of years ago others were seeing this in their elected officials or dictators as well. But tomorrow seems to always come, so back to the point at hand. I've always found that to be a profoundly dangerous place for the human mind to settle in general, this feeling of needing the end. Not because civilization is fragile, it's proven remarkably resilient, but because once people begin viewing catastrophe as desirable, suffering starts to look like collateral damage instead of tragedy. Neighbors become obstacles, institutions targets, and ordinary people sadly become acceptable sacrifices in service of some imagined dawn waiting just beyond the smoke. Reality, of course, has little interest in romantic narratives. History's collapses have never resembled the paintings or the prophecies. They're untidy, they're hungry, they leave children without parents, families without homes, and entire generations carrying scars they never asked for. There's nothing cinematic about watching the lights go out. Ask anyone who's lived through a war, genocide, or collapse of a nation. They rarely speak of destiny, they speak of survival. Perhaps that's why I'm wary whenever anyone seems eager for everything to fall apart. Not concerned, not vigilant, those are different emotions. Eager. One hopes to weather the storm, and that's perfectly understandable. The other begins praying for the flood, and it's those that are troubling. Now, for all our fascination with endings, I think we've misunderstood what an ending actually is. History's littered with worlds that ended. Something we covered on our very last episode, in fact. The ages and eras died, each in their own way. Generations passed and the world collapsed in its own unique way. However, humanity did not. Even the darkest moments we've covered tonight, the Black Death, World Wars, nuclear terror, Heaven's Gate, millennial panic, felt absolute to the people living through them. They couldn't see beyond the horizon they were standing on. We can. We know another morning came. It's one of the strangest quirks of being human. We always imagine ourselves living in the final chapter, as I stated before. It's because uncertainty feels unbearable. Because our brains evolved to anticipate danger rather than stability. And again, we crave significance. Reality is much quieter. Most of us will never witness the end of the world. We will witness the end of jobs, the end of technologies, the end of governments, of ideas, the end of certainties we once thought eternal. And if we're fortunate enough to live long enough lives, we will also witness beginnings that today seem impossible. Children born this year will inherit a world neither you nor I can honestly predict. They'll laugh at our fears the same way we smile at predictions from centuries ago. They will have their own apocalypses to worry about, and will likely believe those are just around the corner too. Perhaps that's simply part of the inheritance of being human. Every generation believes it stands at history's edge, and still, every generation is almost always wrong. So maybe the healthier perspective isn't to obsess over whether the curtain falls, but rather to ask what kind of actor you intend to be while you're still on stage. Because regardless of whether the world has another 1,000 years or another 1,000,000, you only ever receive one performance. Make something worthy of the time you've been given. And maybe that's why that one line has always resonated with me so deeply. Not because it's promise or prophecy, but because it's an aspiration. So, here's to life everlasting and world without end. And may the morning always come. With that, I know we didn't have one in episode 9, so it's certainly time to bring it back, especially after a heavy episode like that. We couldn't have a 10th episode without a refreshing drink and some time in the comfort of the decompression chamber. Oh boy, so where to begin with the end of the world? I think we should do as we usually do in decompression and talk media that we identify most with the subject. And boy, is there a lot. There was a section during the 90s when popcorn flicks had to be apocalyptic. Deep Impact, Armageddon, etc., etc. If there was an end of the world scenario, it was there with Ben Affleck and Aerosmith. Let's see, what other movies? Threads. Threads is the big one that comes to mind when I think apocalyptic media. And oh boy, is it a doozy. I recommend, if you are unfamiliar with it, to look it up first. Definitely give it a watch if you can stomach it. Just don't make it your Friday night comfort flick, I would suggest. Would it be a spoiler to say that Cabin in the Woods fits into this category nicely for apocalyptic? If so, whoops. There's more genres for apocalyptic film than I think any other subtype. Zombies, contagions, as I said, disaster flicks. Quite a few video games that are apocalyptic. All of the Shin Megami Tensei series, aside from Persona, we talked about that. Majora's Mask. 3 days in game has never felt so oppressive. There's a lot that you could count. It goes kind of into the post-apocalyptic thing, though, so I'm trying not to cover that so much. That's an entirely different, can of worms. As far as books go, The Stand. God, I want to say The Road because it was so good. Cormac McCarthy is amazing with words, and the movie was just such a gut punch. But again, that's more post-apocalyptic. TV shows, The Last of Us. Hell, half of Twilight Zone qualifies. Cellar Out of Space, I guess, as far as cosmic horror into the worlds go. And, of course, there's a lot of different kaiju films and the like. Cloverfield, Shin Godzilla. Definitely scratches the disaster itch. I'm not sure if it quite gets into apocalyptic, though. Now, I did post online asking for viewer input, or I should say listener input. And so we've got a couple of suggestions there. Ashley writes The Walking Dead, Mad Max, Wall-E. There's one I didn't really think of. And again, not one where humanity so much goes away as they evolve into a different form. Not a very favorable one, but again, a good example of the cyclical nature of things with Wall-E. I wouldn't have thought of that. Ian writes, I'm quite partial to the more fantastical bits of the post-apocalyptic media, like Vampire Hunter D, Fist of the North Star, Akira. Wow, yeah. I hadn't thought about that before. Again, more of a post-apocalyptic than pre or, present, which is more of the focus here. But God, I haven't seen Vampire Hunter D in a long time. I'm not very much of an anime fan, but that was definitely one of my favorites. Tony here, a longtime supporter of the channel, has quite the interesting post here. Recently, I watched Three Body Problem. It's an interesting exploration of impending doom. Aliens are coming to Earth purporting to be saviors, but it will take 400 years for them to reach us. They have ways of influencing humans on Earth to do their bidding, and to the ones investigating, it looks extremely suspect. The world is reeling from the news that aliens are real, and we have communicated with them, and that we are facing possible destruction of our civilization in mere centuries if they turn out to be lying. It was mind-bending and thought-provoking. It's on Netflix if you want to check it out. I've been meaning to check this out for quite some time. I just haven't quite gotten around to it yet. This will definitely be a push for me to check that out, though. One that does come to mind, I know it got a lot of hate. I'm not a big M. Night Shyamalan fan at all. What a twist. However, I did thoroughly enjoy Knock at the Cabin. I think that's what it was called. It's the one that had Batista in it. Oh, yeah, and Rupert Grint. But, yeah, It is a straightforward. It's definitely a back and forth. A lot of people didn't like the twist ending, but I honestly I thought it was kind of refreshing to see it go there for once. I won't spoil it. Definitely recommend it though. It's a good character study. I could go in depth with that movie, how each of the four people represent the different horsemen of the apocalypse and things like that. Very underrated. I think a lot of people hated it just because they didn't like the ending. And of course, it was, the big twist for the twist's sake, but I appreciated where it went. Of course, if you want the gold standard for cosmic inevitability, it's hard to beat Melancholia. The entire film's built around a planet drifting towards Earth, and unlike most disaster movies, there's no miracle, no secret weapon, no last-minute salvation. It's a meditation on acceptance more than catastrophe, which is definitely interesting. Other recent ones, Don't Look Up. Less about the comet than our inability to agree on reality even when the evidence is literally visible in the sky. Whether you loved it or hated it, it certainly struck a nerve. Personally, I am more of a fan of the cosmic entities and end of the world. I guess you could count Bloodborne kind of like that. If Lovecraft wrote a fevered dream after reading too much gothic literature, there you go. But yes, definitely leaning taste-wise more towards cosmic horror myself. Give me unknowable entities over zombies any day of the week. And on that note, I think we'll be wrapping it up there. Feel free to write in with your thoughts or any comments on the subject. I'd love to hear them. Or if you need to summon Shumagorath to get back together with your ex, well, send me a $5 and we'll see what we can come up with. You can't see me winking, but it's there. As I said before, we're moving to a weekly format, so I will see you next Friday as we dive into how and why we should make and cultivate our own realities, at least as a bit of a vacation every now and then. Virtual reality, themed events, reenactments, rituals, and more, as episode 11 delves into escapism. Until then, keep the fire stoked and the lanterns full. This has been Liam Blackwood, and you've been listening to Occam's Lantern.